Welcome to the last installment of the CTU 2022 Statistics Lecture Series. Today, we are joined by Dr. Cheung, who will be discussing N-of-1 trials. So, Dr. Cheung, and also please hold your questions to the end of the presentation. Dr. Cheung, please go ahead and take over.
Great, thank you, Sandy, and thanks for coming, everyone. And again, I'm Ken Cheung. I'm currently a faculty at Columbia University in the Department of Biostatistics, but I've been working with the CTU for several years now. It's been a great pleasure, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk about some of the innovative study designs for clinical trials. And for today, the specific goal is talk about, as Sandy mentioned, N-of-1 trial design. And as you will see during the study, this type of trial has several names. Sometimes it's called personalized trial. So as you can see in the title, but we'll go for that during the hour. Let me see if I can. So in this presentation, these are the few questions that I like to address. First, we want to have a definition of what an N-of-1 trial is, or a personalized trial. Second, what are the indications for N-of-1 trials? When N-of-1 trials will be applicable and when will it not be applicable? And third, what are the study design elements of an N-of-1 study? What factors that we need to consider when we plan such studies? That's the third question. Number four, we're going to see how N-of-1 trials are analyzed and reported in the literature, just to give us a sense of the statistical analysis issue in it. And if there is time, I'll go into more details about how to evaluate N-of-1 trials and to see whether it actually is useful, and also talk about some sample size consideration issue again if there's time. First, a definition. An N-of-1 trial is a patient-centric experiment. It is patient-centric in the sense that it randomizes a single patient to multiple treatments in a multiple crossover fashion. And the goal of an N-of-1 trial is to really identify the right treatment for that specific individual. So it's patient-centric. And in the circle part on the diagram here, it shows the simplest form of an N-of-1 trial design that compares two treatments, A and B. And the patient is to receive the two treatments in a multiple crossover fashion, right? And with a determined treatment periods. So how many treatment periods that we want to test these treatments in that particular patient. And then we're going to measure the outcomes on a regular schedule, as in a conventional randomized control trial in RCT. And so again, I'd like to emphasize that N-of-1 is patient-centric, in contrast to a conventional randomized control trial, where participants, where multiple participants are randomized to one single treatment arm. So in N-of-1 trial, one individual will be tested with different treatments. In an RCT, one treatment arm will be tested with multiple individuals. So in some way, everything is opposite between the N-of-1 trials and RCT. And the objective of an RCT is really to find a treatment that works well for everyone on average. And I'd like to emphasize on average here. What it means is that even though in an RCT, we may identify a treatment that is superior on average, it is often that the treatment may not work for every single individual, right? So in some way, this is under a knowledge deficiency in general for running RCT, that we don't have an individual treatment effects. We just have a drug that works on average. So N-of-1 trials are applicable under a list of assumptions. So it may not be applied in certain situations, but here's a list of things that we need to consider before we think about doing N-of-1 trials. First, an N-of-1 trial is applicable when there is no cure of a condition or when there is no definitive RCT findings for cure. So in situation that we don't know like what drugs to give to a patient for a certain condition, this may be an opportunity for us to experiment using N-of-1 trial idea. And one possible reason for not having a treatment that works for everyone is that there may just not be sufficient evidence in the literature to support that. Another reason for not having a definitive treatment is that there simply isn't one that works for everyone, right? So in this sense, there's a heterogeneity of treatment effects among individuals in the population. So some drugs may work well for particular individuals, but some other drugs will work for other individuals. So these are the situations where N-of-1 trials would be applicable. And also an N-of-1 trial is appropriate if the disease condition is chronic or when it has recurring symptoms. As you can imagine, if a condition can be resolved quickly, if you want to do repeated experimentation in a crossover study, that may not be feasible because the condition will have been resolved by the time that we switch treatment. So an assumption that we need to bear in mind for running N-of-1 trial is that we're dealing with chronic conditions here. And the last assumption that we need to make is that is about the treatment that we're going to test in an N-of-1 study. That the treatment needs to have rapid onset and minimal carryover effects. Again, this is because of the crossover design we use in an N-of-1 study. However, this last assumption is not as hard as the other three in that there are ways that we could deal with treatments that may have some carryover effects. So that can be handled on an analytical level or in the design level, which I'm going to talk about briefly. So these are there are quite a few assumptions required here, right? So but as it turns out that there are numerous indications that N-of-1 trials can still be appropriate, and you can see the list on the right of the slide, including chronic pain, blood pressure control, insomnia, anxiety, depression, behavioral issues such as medication adherence, and symptom management in chronic diseases. So this is sort of a list of indications that I've seen done in the literature using N-of-1 study, and we're going to look at a few examples in the next few slides. The first example is treating hypertension in children with N-of-1 trials. And to be precise, so this is a work published in Pediatrics in 2019. The report, the investigator reported a series of 32 N-of-1 studies in children. So there are like 32 children, and in each child, 3 blood pressure medications were being tested in 2 cycles over a 10-week period. So in the diagram on the right here, you see that so in the first cycle, 3 drugs will be tested. So these are the 3 drugs pre-specified: amlodipine, hydrochlorothiazide, and lisinopril. And so these are the 3 drugs that are pre-specified, and each drug is to be tested over 2 weeks period. At the end of the first cycle, only 2 drugs will be continued to be tested in cycle 2. And then at the end of the study, the participant will be asked to select a medication based on a number of criteria. Basically, based on the ambulatory blood pressure, whether it's normal, you fell back to the normal range, and whether there's a substantial reduction in the systolic blood pressure compared to baseline, and whether the drug has side effects or not. So these are the information will be communicated to the patients, and then based on this communication, the participant will be asked to make a decision on what medication to use. So this is the first example of treating hypertension in children using N-of-1 studies. The second example is also treating hypertension, but in adults. And this is a report of a series of 7 N-of-1 trials. So the design is similar. Again, it's a multi-period crossover design, but it is different from the previous study in children, in that in the previous study, each child would receive exactly the same 3 BP medications during the experimentation. In this study, Cheung et al., each individual will be tested with different drugs. And actually, they may be tested with different number of drugs for the blood pressure control. So the table here shows that that basically some participants are tested with 2 drugs, and some will be tested with up to 4 drugs. So and also in this study, we're going to track the BP medication taken by the participant before they started the N-of-1 study. And in this study, again, each BP medication will be tested over a 2-week period, and during which we'll measure two-week period during which we'll measure the blood pressure data on a daily basis, twice in the morning, twice at night, and we also track side effects, whether they take the medications, and at the end of the trial, they'll be asked to answer questions about whether the N-of-1 trials were useful. So again, these are sort of the pretty standard in terms of collecting the type of data that are collected for a blood pressure control study. And so, and these medication may have carryover effects, right? So the way that we control for that is to first, we're going to do it in 2 ways. First, we're between each treatment periods, there'll be a 1-week washout period. So this is to make sure that medication from the previous treatment period will not have an impact. Second, while each medication is tested over a 2-week period, we will only use data from the 2nd week collected during that period for the analysis, so that the data from week 1 in some way may have still some residual washout carryover effects. So that's why we only use 2nd week. So this approach is what we call analytical washout. So we do a physical washout 1 week, and then we do a analytical washout of another week, so as to minimize the impact of carryover effect. So this is the second example of doing of N-of-1 study in the literature. The third example is of N-of-1 trial is treating patients with chronic musculoskeletal pain. So in this study, a total of 215 patients would be randomized to an N-of-1 trial and usual care. So it is an interesting study design in that participants are not randomized to a pain management plan. Rather, participants are randomized to an N-of-1 trial that compares different pain management plan. And to be specific, each individual will be given 2 plans, and then they'll be tested throughout the experimentation period. Yeah, and so this is this study design is slightly different from the previous 2 in that there's a control arm in that participant will just receive care in a non-N-of-1 fashion. And the key here is that the comparison is again not about which management plan is better, but it's rather is whether its N-of-1 trials is better than usual care. So you may imagine that that under usual care, some participant may receive exactly the same pain management plan than participant in the N-of-1 trial. But again, we're not looking at how we deal with pains, but we're looking at whether N-of-1 trial help come up with a good decision of the pain medication. And during the studies, we're going to use, so the primary endpoint of the study is PROMIS pain interference scale. It's item 8, and the endpoint is defined as change from baseline to 6 months. So a small change is good. Hopefully we have a negative change. So that's the basic study design, 215 to N-of-1 versus usual care. This is our third example, and the last example we look at is a hypothetical study that evaluates N-of-1 clinical surveys for muscle cramps in people with ALS. The design here is similar to the previous example in that half of the participants will be randomized to an N-of-1 trial that compare 2 medications for muscle cramp in people with ALS. The 2 medications here were mesoleptin and baclofen. So this is the N-of-1 trial arm that participant will be randomized will be treated with these 2 medications in a crossover manners. And each treatment period is about 2 weeks. And during the 2-week period, we're going to measure the muscle cramp scale developed by a colleague at Columbia on a weekly basis. So we have a regular schedule of measurements. And again, in terms of design, there's no physical washout in this study, in that participant will be taking medication continuously, just different medications. But in order to avoid carryover effect, again, we're going to do the analytical washout in that we're going to use the 2nd week data point for comparison. So that is the N-of-1 trial arm. The another half of the participant in this study would be randomized to center of care. So the treating physician would just prescribe a drug that to manage muscle cramp for the patient. So again, the emphasis here is that we're not comparing whether drug A is better than drug B. Rather, the goal is to see that where after the N-of-1 study, the participant will choose a drug that will help better than a drug prescribed by the treating physician alone. So so it's sort of is again the same study design as in the previous study. And what I like to emphasize in this particular study is about the choice of the endpoint, because as you know, ALS is a neurodegenerative disease. The patient will have like a sort of declining function over time, but this is not about the function. It's more about symptoms management, specifically muscle cramp in these people. And as you can see that in this data set that this is pilot data in about, I think, 30 patients, and we see that over the study period or observation period of these individuals, the muscle cramp is relatively stable, whereas there's a huge variability across individuals. So each line indicates the trajectory of a participant over time. So this is the type of data or outcome that would benefit when we use N-of-1 trial. So if a huge between subject variability, but relatively steady state within the individual over time. So this, again, this is one of the assumptions that would be useful to have when we use N-of-1 study. So these are the 4 examples: 2 in treating hypertension, 1 in treating chronic pain, 1 in treating symptoms in ALS people. So quickly, a list of indications that for which that N-of-1 trials are not applicable, and so N-of-1 trial is not applicable when we have a disease that is rapidly progressive or rapidly fatal. Again, because the idea of N-of-1 is that we're going to treat patient in multiple crossover design. If patient decline quickly, there's no way we could conduct experiment. And treatment with slow onset or prolonged carryover effect might not be ideal candidate for N-of-1 trials. Again, it can be done using physical washout or analytical washout, but so there's some limitation there. And third, the N-of-1 trial is not feasible actually when the patient and the physician or clinicians are not sufficiently interested in using experiment to reduce the uncertainty in the therapeutics. Because as you can imagine that because of the crossover design and the regular measurements are taken during the study, running an N-of-1 trial is much more labor intensive than say running an RCT because of the frequent scheduling and then the switchover. So logistically, it can be a burden to both the patient and also the treating physician. So these are some of the conditions under which N-of-1 trials may not be feasible. So this is a list of consideration of study design for N-of-1 trials. So we've looked at a few elements in the previous examples, but I'll just go over them quickly here. First, the number of treatments considered. So we've seen that. So we could look at the same treatments across N-of-1 trials, or we could look at different treatments, as in cognition, or that different individuals will be tested with different BP medications. So, but this is something that we need to pre-specify. And again, we don't want to impose too much burden on patients. So chances are, I have not seen any study that tests more than 4 treatments in an individual. So this is something that we need to bear in mind, that the more treatments that we consider, the better chance we find something good, but it also imposes additional burden to the patients. And a related issue is the study duration. Again, if we test more treatments, we need a longer duration to and more crossover just to run through all the treatments available. Issue that we've again talked about, washout period. We could apply physical washout or analytical washout. A fourth issue that we need to think about is whether blinding is feasible. When we do test N-of-1 trials, when we use N-of-1 trials to test drugs, chances are it is feasible, although getting placebo pill can be there's some logistical issue. But for some of the behavioral interventions, blinding may not be feasible. So this is something that we need to think more carefully. If blinding is not possible, we may need to consider how we want to measure or collect the outcome, so as to reduce placebo effects or just bias, simply because of the fact that people know what they're getting. The last point about study design on the left column is inclusion exclusion. So the one thing, I think one advantage of running N-of-1 study is that when we run a conventional RCT, we have basically a list of inclusion exclusion criteria, and one so the basic idea is we want to exclude a lot of patients with a lot of comorbidities, right? So and that may make things not feasible in an RCT. The advantage of N-of-1 trial is that we have some flexibility in terms of whom to include, because at the end of the day, the comparison is within that individual. So we are not aiming to generalize the treatment decision of that individual to the entire population. So in that sense, we'll have some flexibility in terms of whom to include and whom to exclude. We could even include participants with multiple comorbidities. So those people are usually excluded in an RCT. So in terms of data collection in an N-of-1 trial, we need to consider again carefully, especially when blinding is not feasible. But we also want to consider modality or like instruments that can be easily collected, because we do need to have relatively frequent and regular measurements. So if you take like an hour to, if we take an hour to go for an instrument each time, it might not be feasible. And at some time point, we may want to consider wearable devices such as ambulatory blood pressure or using mobile app to perform EMA ecological momentary assessment. So these are the few consideration points when you think about how do we want to collect outcomes in N-of-1 trials. Safety and secondary endpoints are important to patients. It is true in an RCT, but I think it's more important in an N-of-1 trial, in that at the end of the trial, patients will make a treatment decision based on the result of the N-of-1 trials. And usually patient would take into a number of factors then in addition to just to the primary endpoint, because in RCT, in some way we define the primary endpoint, power the study based on the primary endpoint, and then run the study and make a decision. But in N-of-1 trials, patients will likely take a composite endpoint approach, looking at safety, secondary as well as primary. For example, in the blood pressure control, so patient would definitely look at safe side effects to make decision in addition to whether it works in terms of reducing blood pressure. And a related point is that we need to know what type of information to communicate to the patient, to the participants. We want to give patients we want the patients to make decisions that are fully informed, but we don't want to overwhelm with a lot of other information that may not be relevant in managing the condition. So this is a type of things that need to be considered when during the planning of an N-of-1 study. And the last issue is sample size, which I'll mention in a few slides later. So, but this is already an issue from a statistical point, how many patients that will need. But in this context, we also need to consider how many treatment periods that each patient needs to go through. So now let's look at how N-of-1 trials are analyzed and reported in the literature in the previous example. So again, going back to the first example of treating hypertension in children. In this report, 32 children with hypertension completed N-of-1 trials. And then at the end of the study, remember that there are two cycles. The first cycle, three medication were tested in the first cycle, and then 2 were tested in the second cycle. And then at the end of second cycle, a decision is being made so the participant would choose a medication to continue. And so of the 3 medications tested in the study, so we see the distribution of medications selected by the participants. So about 50% of the participant chose lisinopril, but we do see that some variability in terms of like what medication people are treated. And of the 32, 4 participants did not achieve blood pressure control, so there was no medication was selected. So this is a possible outcome. So so we do see that the medication selected varies quite a bit across patients, although actually on the population level, lisinopril seems to be doing better on average compared to amlodipine and the other medications. So we do see we did do a population level analysis to confirm that, but individually, some individual obviously prefer other drugs. And what is important is that in this study, we also know we also recorded like the BP medication before the N-of-1 study. As it turns out, over 50% of the participants changed the medication as a result of N-of-1 study. So it just showed that N-of-1 trials change patients' perspective and in some way add information to the treatment decision that patients make. So this is typically how N-of-1 trials are reported, the distribution of drugs selected, and then whether change the opinion of the medications. So it's fairly similar in the second hypertension study that we looked at. Again, 7 adults with hypertension completed N-of-1 trials, and so this is a full table. So this gives the treatment before the N-of-1 trial, and these are the treatment sequence. And you can see that at the end of the trial, so participants were asked to indicate their preference of the BP medication as a result of N-of-1 study. So, for example, for patient A, the preference remains the same as the prior treatment. But for patient C, it resulted in a change in the treatment preference. So before the study, the patient took amlodipine. At the end of the N-of-1 trial, the patient found out that losartan may work better for that individual, and as a result of that, that patient was prescribed this losartan after the trial. So, and in these 7 individuals, 1 resulted in changing treatments, and 1 resulted in identifying a treatment in that patient D did not have any prior medication before the study, but N-of-1 trial just helped the individuals to identify a treatment that would go forward. And at the end of the trial, the participants were asked to answer whether they found the trial was useful. The results are quite positive. Again, majority of the participants found that N-of-1 trials are very helpful or more so. So this is, again, the type of analysis or presentation that people made out at the end of N-of-1 trials. We've seen how N-of-1 trials are reported in the literature in 2 examples, and those are quite typical. And these reports are very useful in terms of demonstrating that there's a heterogeneity in the preference for like treatments, right? So different individuals may prefer different treatments. And it also demonstrated that N-of-1 trials are effective at changing the people's medication preference, and then the participants seems to have positive feedback. So these are very small series, but they're quite representative of what's shown in the literature, that N-of-1 trials seem to be effective in changing people's opinion. But as from a scientific viewpoint, these type of analysis might not be useful in the sense that we actually don't know whether N-of-1 trials produce better treatment decisions. In both Samuel et al. And Cheung et al., at the end of the N-of-1 trials, participants selected the treatment that they like. But what's lacking is that we actually don't know whether the N-of-1 trial themselves is useful, or whether it's actually better than just going to your primary care physician, for example, and then ask the physician to give you a BP med, right? So one element that is missing in this report is that there's no control arm, or more specifically, there's no control arm that does the usual care thing. That's a non-N-of-1 approach. The other design element that is missing from this report is that there's no additional follow-up of the outcomes of the individuals after they've selected the treatment. So again, patients selected the treatment based on N-of-1 trial, but we in some way we want to be able to reproduce the benefit in that individuals by continuing to follow up to those individuals with the selected treatment. So this is also missing in these two reports. So it comes to the third example that I talk about, the chronic pain example, where a participants would be randomized to either receiving an N-of-1 trial or usual care, and this study actually called preempt, and you actually have provision for the two missing design elements I mentioned in the previous slide. So again, the participants will be randomized to the N-of-1 trials comparing two pain management plans, and at the end of the study, the goal is to look at the primary endpoint defined as 6 months on the PROMIS scale, pain interference. And the reason why the investigator chose a 6-month time point as a primary endpoint is that because by that time, all the participants would have been selected a medication on the N-of-1 trial and stayed with the medication for long enough period so that there's a sufficient amount of information to see whether that drug actually works in the participants. So this is how the primary endpoint duration is defined as 6 months. And then at the end of the trial, we just compare outcomes in the N-of-1 trials versus usual care. And you can see from the table that, as it turns out, there is no statistical significance between the two arms, meaning that there's no evidence that N-of-1 trials add quality in terms of treatment decision compared to usual care, which basically is that go to clinic and then let the treating team to give you a pain management plan. But as we look at the data more closely, there's some marginal indication that the N-of-1 intervention here is the N-of-1 arm has resulted in a larger decrease in the pain interference. So the change is -3.22 compared to control of -1.85. The difference is not significant, as indicated by the confidence interval, but the p-value is 0.09. So that's some marginal indication. But again, based on this result, there's no N-of-1 trial in this context does not seem to add value to usual care. So this actually is a schema of what preempt study design looks like. Again, when we screen for eligibility, and then we randomize participants to receiving either N-of-1 trials or standard of care. And then in the N-of-1 trial, it is a multi-period crossover design. So participants are randomized to drug A and drug B in a random order, and then we track the outcome on a regular basis. We have the same measurement schedule for the standard of care, except that the treatment will be given based on standard of care. And then at the end of the treatment period, or experimentation period, we'll generally report and then communicate with the patients about the findings in the N-of-1 trials. And based on that, the patient will make a decision on what treatment that they're going to use, and to be followed for additional treatment periods. And this is what I call a validation phase. So because the value of this validation phase is that we want to reproduce the outcome, the benefits of the selected treatment here compared to the experimentation phase. And so that we can compare it to the control arm to show N-of-1 trials is useful. As I shown in the two first example with patients with hypertension, this is a type of result that usually people report in the literature, that they just show the experimentation phase to talk about the randomized order and the result of the N-of-1 trials. But what should have been done in an N-of-1 trial is that we need to have a control arm, that is standard of care, and we also need to have follow-up period after a drug is selected. So this is these are the two study elements that are typically missing, but would be useful to have in designing N-of-1 trials. So the last factor that I like, study consideration that I like to talk about is sample size, right? So, but in N-of-1 trials, there are actually two types of sample size. One is the traditional sense that how many patients do we need to treat at the program level. For example, if this is a schema that I study schema that I showed in the previous slide, the sample size here is how many was N here, right? So how many patients will be treated at N-of-1 trial and how many patients will be treated as the standard of care. So that's one type of sample size we need to consider. The other type of sample size we need to consider is that how long is this experimentation period? Because intuitively, the longer this experimentation phase, the better informed the patient will be in terms of making what treatment to take. But on the other hand, you also lengthen the study duration. You also add to the burden, also add to the logistical difficulty because of the crossover design. So this is a set of consideration, how long this should be, and how long should patient be followed up after a treatment is selected. So these are the two types of sample size that we need to consider. So these are some rule of thumbs. Again, if we have a long follow-up period or if we have a long experimentation period, we'll have more information to make decisions, which is good, but it definitely adds burdens to patients. And there's some rule of thumbs without giving you exact like the duration. The first rule of thumb is that for every part of experimentation, so for example, if we want to experiment in a participants in a crossover fashion for 3 months, we should have about twice the length for the validation. So if we do a crossover design in 3 months, we want to have at least 6 months follow-up. So this is a calculation based on the fact that this design will maximize patient benefits during the study. So the intuition is that if we have too long experimentation, we may be exposing the patients to the inferior treatment for too long. So that's why the optimal ratio is that we want to test one part of experimentation with 2 parts of validation. And then on the program level, how many patients that we need to have, to randomize to N-of-1 trials. The conventional sense says that the larger the N, the better power there is. This is also true in this context. But what is more important is that statistical power to validate N-of-1 trials usefulness is also proportional to the extent of the heterogeneous treatment effect. So what it means is that if we believe that if a treatment will work consistently well across individuals in the population, chances are N-of-1 trial will not be useful. And if you want to use it, test it, it will require a huge sample size to show that it's useful. But in situation when on average there's no treatment effects, but we do see that there are effects in individuals, but they are different from across individuals. This is where N-of-1 trials will be useful, and that can be achieved with relatively few sample size. And so that's actually a power calculator on the internet that if we have time, we can come back and go through that. But this is sort of the consideration. So whether N-of-1 trials is useful and we can address the power issue, it depends on how much heterogeneity of treatment effects we believe there is. So in the presentation, I covered the definition of N-of-1 trial, that it is a patient-centric study aiming to identify an optimal treatment for a specific individual. We've looked at use cases of N-of-1 trials in blood pressure control, chronic pain, and symptom management in ALS, people with ALS. We've looked at how N-of-1 trials may be analyzed and reported, and how N-of-1 trials should be evaluated. And basically, the study schema where we have half of participants to N-of-1 trials, half to issue care, and some brief discussion on sample size considerations. So additional issue that we did not discuss, but I'm just going to refer you to the literature in this JAMA pediatric paper that discuss all the analytical issues, including missing data, how do we use data visualization in N-of-1 trials. Data visualization is very important because a critical element of N-of-1 trials is to communicate to patients the findings so that they can make informed decisions. So, and with patients, sometimes it's useful to show the picture graphically to help them understand what's going on. So I think data visualization itself is very important for N-of-1 trials, and other analytical issue that we have not discussed here, but is important, is whether and how we should pull data across patients. The focus of N-of-1 trial is to identify an optimal treatment for the individual. It's not to generalize the findings to other people, but in some situations it might be useful just to get a sense of what's going on at the population level, how often people would prefer treatment A versus treatment B. So that can be done usually in a Bayesian framework. So that is also discussed in the article. And a very important practical element in running N-of-1 trial is to incorporate patient preference in designing N-of-1 trial. So this is actually why in Crohn's et al., different patients would have different BP medication on trial. That's first based on the patient background and also the patient preference. And what's interesting is that we found that not only that in some therapeutic areas that there's a heterogeneity of treatment effect, but actually there's a heterogeneity of patient preference for different types of design elements. So this is actually a distribution of the results that so we can, for example, we would on average guess that some on average patient would prefer an N-of-1 trial if it does not cost them anything. So which is indicated by if the utility on the to the right of 0. On average, that's correct, but it's interesting in this study, we found that in some individuals, they actually prefer N-of-1 trials if they have to pay. So this is an interesting finding that we did not anticipate, but there's actually should be an heterogeneity in the preference of how we design N-of-1 trials. And why this is important is that again, because it's so intensive in terms of the involvement of the patients and the physicians, we want to design the study so that we have buy-in from patients. So that's why incorporating patient preference is very important practically in N-of-1 trials. And this is my last slide, and that's actually a whole special issues on Harvard Data Science Review discussing N-of-1 trial design statistics and examples. So I think this will be a useful resources if you are interested in your own study. Again, there's several indications that in your study that you may find appropriate. I'll be happy to talk about how that might be implemented in your own study. So with that, thanks for your attention.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Cheung. This has been very informative. And if there are any questions that come up from anyone, please reach out to the doctor directly, or you can contact me and I will forward the question to you. And also this lecture will be posted to the videocast website. It's taking about a week for that to happen.
Okay.
So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great Friday.